You're watching a Highwire Media podcast. In May of 1999, 19-year-old Katie Puyer went missing from a Moose Lake convenience store where she was working alone as a night clerk. A grainy black and white surveillance video captures a man with his arm at the back of Katie's neck as he forces her out of the store. He said Katie Puyer was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, the question tonight is, where is Katie Puyer? What would unfold within the next few months would shock and disgust Minnesota. After that happens, what do you do? In this episode of Murder Monday, I'll be covering the homicide of Katie Puyer and the courageous work of her family who fought to set in place Katie's law. Donald Blum may have killed her, but he never got her soul. Katie's story has been told numerous times within American true crime culture and media. She's been covered on episodes of Forensic Files, On the Case with Paula Zahn, See No Evil, and more, including countless podcasts like mine. Her case is nationally known for the incredible forensic science used to convict the man guilty of her murder, Donald Blum. Technically, Donald was convicted without Katie's body, which is extremely rare and the first of its kind. It also brought an end to the trend of perpetrators abducting convenience store workers in rural Minnesota. Not only did forensic technology catch up with Donald's crimes, but technology in general, like surveillance cameras. I cover a lot of cases where, unfortunately, the victims don't get the coverage they deserve or the funds toward their case to adequately investigate. If Katie Puyer is a case of the justice system and the media all working well together, the way it should be working for every victim. The Puyer family fought for the public's right afterward, which saved many future victims by tightening up our sexual offender laws. As Dakota County Attorney James Backstrom said in response to the case, Blum is a classic example of a person with a criminal history that led to changes for patterned and sexually dangerous offenders that now exist in Minnesota law. Katie was working at a Conoco convenience store. The store sits by itself a few hundred feet away from Interstate Highway 35 on the southern outskirts of Moose Lake. Its round-the-clock hours and large driveway made it a popular spot for truckers. Katie had just started her night shift, and about a half an hour later, customers notified police that the store was unattended. This was about 11:40 p.m. Katie's denim shirt, checkbook, and car keys were left behind. The store was completely empty. No money or merchandise appeared to be missing from the store. At about 1:50 a.m., Pam and Steve Puyer received a phone call that Katie was missing from the store. Her family left Mikado at 2:30 a.m. and were in the convenience store parking lot by 6 a.m. that morning, desperate to find Katie. A grainy black and white surveillance video from inside the store showed Katie being forced out of the store. He had his hands at the back of Katie's neck and was forcing her out of the store. He may have had a cord wrapped around her neck. Police estimated the suspect was in his 20s and 170 pounds and wearing a New York Yankees jersey. Katie was just over 5 feet tall with blonde hair and was wearing slacks and a light-colored top. Throughout the day, authorities widened the search to include I-35 ditches and other woodlands nearby. Busloads of volunteers began a ground search through the dense woods and along deserted roads. Also, an air search. Deputies with dogs searched brush and areas near the store. Local police were getting assistance from Carleton County, the Minnesota BCA, and the FBI. Within a few days, then Governor Jesse Ventura activated the National Guard, and hundreds of volunteers helped with the search. The volunteer effort went on. Investigators had eyewitness reports from a nearby store. The night of Katie's disappearance, a report of a man driving around Moose Lake earlier Wednesday night, the night Katie went missing, staring at women and girls. With this witness, they secured a sketch of the suspect to be released. 10 days into her disappearance, Pam and Steve Puyer sat in their living room, remembering when Katie would have bad dreams, and Pam calmed her by talking about getting candy at the July 4th parade, or when Katie was nervous and started twirling her hair. The Puyers said they hoped the current nightmare soon has a happy ending. Her parents showed no ill will towards her abductor, but they pleaded with him to release her unharmed, adding they wanted to see her water skiing and fishing with her brother and cousins. Signs of Katie were everywhere in her parents' home. Part of Katie's doll collection was kept in her old room. Her parents pleaded, "I know there's some goodness deep down inside him. if he would just let it come out and just let her go. So far, no sign of Katie nor the man seen in her disappearance, though she receives massive media coverage and tips. Katie is featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, and a website is created on Katie's behalf named findkatie.com. Detectives have multiple witnesses report a suspicious black pickup truck, along with a partial license plate. With this information, investigators are led to a man named Donald Blum. Donald was working at the Minnesota Veterans Home prior to Katie's disappearance under the name Donald Hutchinson. On June 8th, a former coworker of his called the police tip line and said Donald Hutchinson looks similar to the man in the composite sketch. He said Donald was absent on the day after Katie's abduction, had recently cut his hair and stopped driving his black pickup truck, and without notice, quit his job. Blum owned a 20-acre property in Moose Lake, 12 miles from the convenience store from which Katie was abducted. He also had an extensive violent history within Minnesota that spanned decades. Blum at this point was a 6-time serious violent sex offender. Minnesota was furious at the news of Blum's arrest and criminal history once it was released. While Donald was held, he refused to speak with detectives and asked for an attorney. Meanwhile, detectives got warrants to conduct searches for any evidence regarding the disappearance of Katie on any of Donald's properties. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources sent 85 firefighters and 6 supervisors from around the state to help with the search on the property. Donald's trailer home is 12 miles from the convenience store where Katie was working. Carlton County Sheriff Dave Sabo asked firefighters to search several lakes with soil type that had been collected during the investigation. The soil came from Blum's clothing or vehicles. Human remains were found on his land. Many small bone fragments and teeth were found on his property near Moose Lake. The bone fragments were charred and came from a fire pit. Forensic labs at the Minnesota BCA determined that the burned bone fragments represented many different parts of the body. It is also possible that some of the recovered fragments are not Katie Puyer. Donald Blum said he didn't know whose remains were found on his property, but they are definitely not Katie's remains. Evidence obtained in Katie's case included a chainsaw, a knife, knotted rope, and a fire pit containing bones. Also found was a 55-gallon drum of flammable material, similar to fuel oil, as well as a silver hoop earring in a front man's pocket. In an earlier search warrant, authorities said they were looking for a pair of silver hoop earrings, and one single hoop earring was found. But Katie's mother, Pam, said the earring found was not Katie's. Investigators had burnt tooth fragments and some remaining bone fragments that didn't match Katie's identified remains. Also, DNA from blondish head hairs found in his pickup truck also did not match Katie Puyer. Searches of his home in Richfield and rural Carlton County turned up several guns, illegal for him to possess as a convicted felon, and what proved to be human blood. They found newspaper articles mentioning Katie in the upstairs closet. The firearms possession resulted in Blum being charged in federal court as being a felon. After 2 months in prison on September 8th, Donald tearfully confessed to abducting and killing Katie Puyer, and that the remains found on his property were hers. First, however, Donald signaled his willingness to a plea agreement during an interview with a Twin Cities TV station. Soon after, a deal was reached, and Blum called relatives before formally confessing to killing Katie Puyer. His confession was vague, and he referred to Katie as the girl. He said that on May 26 he had gone fishing, and then driven home to Richfield. However, later that evening, he had returned to his Moose Lake property. On the way, he stopped to purchase liquor. He had seen Katie in the store working. He had not known her, but had made a grab for her. He had followed her and forced her into his pickup truck. Then he had driven her out to his mobile home. Blum told investigators after he took Katie Puyer she was afraid. He had choked her from behind, saying it had taken about 20 minutes for Katie to die. He denied raping her. Once he knew she was dead, he had placed her body in the fire pit in a fetal position, and then gathered wood and paper to make it burn. Donald soon recanted his confession, and his plea deal was rescinded, saying he falsely confessed. Whether Blum had actually confessed falsely or not would now be for a jury to decide. As authorities prepared to seek first-degree murder charges, the family struggled to accept Blum's revelation that they'll never see Katie again. The horror of the convenience store videotape, the weeks of searching woods and fields for miles, the fading hope, and the arrest and indictment of Donald Blum. Early on, it was hard for Pam to get out of bed, saying, "I'll just sit with the covers over my head. I just didn't care." He even took a lot to dust off her coffee table. Leaving the house was very hard, and if she did go, she wanted to come right back. She started back on cigarettes, lost 25 pounds, and stopped wearing makeup. How she looked to others became an afterthought. First, she prayed Katie would be found alive. Then she prayed the family would simply get an answer about what happened to her. That prayer was answered with Blum's confession. Throughout, the Poirier family became closer, not taking any day together for granted. The support and compassion of an entire state overwhelmed the family. Several boxes and grocery bags filled with letters, many unopened, filled the kitchen and dining area of their home. The letters came from all over the U.S. in spots as far away as Europe and Australia. Pam and Steve tried to take 2 hours each night to read them. Memories and pictures sustained Pam too. Katie loved French fries with a side of ranch dressing, Cabbage Patch dolls and dresses, dogs and movies, Garth Brooks and Stephen King, Days of Our Lives, and the Green Bay Packers. Pam found it funny how Katie, at 5'2" and barely 100 pounds, could eat and eat. She rolled her eyes at the memory of Katie's search for the perfect dress for her junior prom. She grew quiet when thinking back to Katie's first days of kindergarten and how hard it was for Katie to leave her. Pam gave Katie a necklace so she knew that her mom was always close. Some of her favorite moments were the silly, quiet ones, like singing and dancing in the aisles of any store to make Katie blush, or talking on the football weekends when Steve and brother Patrick took over the TV. She'd come over and we'd just flop on the bed and just sit and talk. She was so open to sharing with me, and sometimes she shared too much, but that's good sometimes. Pam would rub Katie's head and braid her hair, adding, "Sometimes we'd be talking and would just fall asleep in the same bed." Even at 18 years of age, she was still that little girl. Pam always liked murder mysteries. Now she shuts them off, saying just the violence of it's not entertaining anymore. She'd rather watch a rerun of I Love Lucy or her favorite TV show, Dallas. Pam is frustrated with the system of justice that allowed Donald Blum to be back on the street years ago with a plea agreement that has fallen apart. Every night at the dinner table, I have an empty spot. He has a mobile home on property near Moose Lake and a home and family in Richfield. No one around them knew about his record. Minnesota does have a law allowing neighbors to know when there's a convicted sex offender living near them, but Blum was released 3 months before it went into effect, so he wasn't required to register with the state. Neighbors knew him for being handy and building furniture in his garage. Now they were learning for the first time about his dangerous past. The trial began in June 2000 and would include over 50 witnesses. He was angry that Donald's attorneys couldn't even face her. Katie and her fiancé Mark had moved together and were students at community college in Carleton, both intending to become state conservation officers, maybe game wardens in Montana or Wyoming after they were married. He had been working and still intended to return to school, but the game warden thing was done. Mark did not attend the first day of the trial. Upon the Poirier family seeing Blum in court for the first time, the family glared at the man who caused them so much pain. Prosecutors had a burnt tooth and human remains that were nearly incinerated, but no DNA evidence linking either to Katie. The remains were burned so badly that forensic experts were unable to make a conclusive link. Though no DNA link was made, the dental work was consistent with Katie. The tooth and human remains were the strongest piece of evidence in the case. Not really one piece of conclusive evidence in the case, but all these little pieces of evidence piled on top of each other, and without his confession, the case would have been more difficult to prove. The prosecution told the jury that the state will prove Blum guilty with the following main elements: the recanted confession, which jurors listened to, testimony of the Subway store clerk who identified Blum as the man she saw outside the convenience store an hour before Katie was abducted, other witnesses who saw Blum's truck cruising Moose Lake that night, testimony of Blum's coworkers at the Minneapolis Veterans Home, testimony of experts who would say that burned remains found on his vacation property were those of a female between 16 and 26, and a taped interview police conducted with Blum when he was arrested about 3 weeks after the abduction. To finish off the trial, the most damning witnesses were 2 of Donald's previous victims. A woman who had searched for Katie and had attended most of the trial told reporters, "If Katie could have gotten away, this could be her testimony. What those poor girls had to go through and this scumbag did to them, and then to come here and to tell them what he did to me, case closed." Blum had paled in age since his arrest. The trial was also beginning to wear down the Poirier family. The 2 women from Donald's 1983 Stillwater offense had their first chance to face Donald in court, something none of his other previous victims got the chance to do because of Donald taking plea deals. The moment of truth arrived in the vortex of one of the most publicized trials in Minnesota history. Now adult women, the survivors did not look at Donald, though he often looked at them. He seemed bored and watched them with a blank expression. The young survivors broke into tears and said, quote, "It's still scary." A recess was then called to give her a break to compose herself. She returned to give her testimony. Donald was hitchhiking and they picked him up. They said he was chatting and said he was a surgeon before pulling a knife, taking over the wheel, and ordering the girls onto the floor out of sight. Later, he locked a 16-year-old girl in the trunk of the car before driving to a secluded road where he parked and then forced them into the woods. If one of them tried to run away, he would say he would kill the other girl. If they fought, he would get angry and choke them from behind, like he admitted to doing to Katie Puyer in his confession. At the time of the 1983 Stillwater attack, the 16-year-old girl was 5'6" and 115 pounds with blonde hair, while the 15-year-old was 5'2" and 110 pounds. Prosecution pointed out earlier how Donald liked his victims petite. Katie Puyer was 5'2" and 95 pounds. Jurors felt the enormity of the case during deliberation. The first vote jurors cast, 11 votes for a guilty verdict, with only one juror not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. Blum's 2-hour tape confession sealed his fate for most jurors. But after another 90 minutes, the last juror came around. After 10.5 hours of deliberation, the vote was unanimous. The jury found Donald Blum guilty of first-degree murder of Katie Puyer. After they left the courtroom, the jurors rushed to their cars and drove away with no comment, having just concluded one of the highest-profile murder cases in Minnesota history. Blum, dressed in casual slacks, shirt and tie, showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He carried on a whispered conversation with his attorney, both before and after the announcement, having just been dealt his 5th conviction involving the abduction of teenage girls. Blum shrugged slightly as a clerk read the guilty verdict. A collective gasp went up in the courtroom from about 60 of Katie's family and friends. Mark Johnson, Katie's fiancé, made it to the courtroom for the first time since the trial began to see Donald get convicted. They pinned ribbons to their shirt in honor of Katie, the same yellow and gold ribbons that those searching for Katie wore last summer. Deep sadness punctuated by moments of anger, hostility towards the legal system, and especially towards Donald Blum. That was the tone in court when the Poyers told Donald Blum what his crime had done to them. Donald Blum received a life sentence for killing Katie. The Puyer family began to pick up the pieces and look towards the future. More than 1,200 mourners filled the high school gym to pay respects to Katie and to bear a call to action on behalf of women and the vulnerable. Katie was described as loving, family-oriented, funny, mischievous, and now at peace with the dominant theme of the service being light over darkness and a call against violence. Separate tragedies helped bring these people together. They were united, however, in their determination to make Minnesota a safer place. They supported Katie's Law, which is an effort to close the loopholes in our criminal justice system that allowed violent people to walk free and reoffend. The family sharply criticized the justice system for freeing the repeated sex offender who killed her. Pam Poirier asked volunteers who helped search for Katie to now start lobbying to make sure convicted felons aren't freed early. Pam became a force for crime prevention laws at the Minnesota legislature. She joined forces with Connie Larson and Patty Wetterling, the mothers of C.J. Larson and Jacob Wetterling, who were victims of other highly publicized crimes in Minnesota. The Katie Puyer Abduction Task Force, law enforcement officers and families of crime victims, helped get passage of a measure dubbed Katie's Law to tighten registration of sex offenders and link law enforcement computers to improve tracking of criminals. A bill to require surveillance cameras in convenience stores stalled in the legislature. Tougher laws were sparked by several highly publicized cases throughout Minnesota history. These cases include 2 parking ramp rapes in 1988 by men with a history of sexual violence and the abduction of Jacob Wetterling in 1989. In terms of laws specifically in Minnesota that could have protected Katie Puyer from a man like Donald Blum, he was released from his last offense before any serious protective laws were in place. By mid-1989, patterned sex offenders had just begun to receive longer sentences. In 1991, sex offenders began registering their addresses with authorities. In 1992, probation officer supervision of released repeat sexual offenders was increased up to 10 years longer than under the previous law. In 1994, indefinite civil commitments of sexually dangerous offenders began. In January 1997, authorities began notifying communities where certain released sex offenders were living. And in 2000, Katie's Law. The loopholes that Donald Blum had walked through were finally closed. The Poirier family knew more tough times were ahead. The next Christmas, the next birthday, the next trip to the Twin Cities. The funeral service that would take place once Katie's remains were secured. Katie was laid to rest alongside the grave of her grandmother. Pam still finds herself stopping and glancing at the back door of her home, hoping Katie will walk through. Reverend Marvin Rinsky shared memories as the pastor who presided at the wedding of Steve and Pam Poirier at the United Methodist Church in Duluth, and as the officiating minister who baptized their daughter Katie. During the trial, some of the witnesses and evidence were excluded. We know of the 15 aliases used by Mr. Blum in a career that seemed to be made up of lies, manipulation, and conflicted behavior. Donald has since passed away while serving a sentence and took every other case unsolved to his grave. Thank you to the Puyer family for sharing Katie with Minnesota. And of course, rest in peace, Katie Puyer. And that is our case for Murder Monday. Give us your thoughts on this case in the comment section below. Give us a thumbs up if you like our video. If you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS or just scan the QR code right there. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.